Hi guys, welcome back to the One Stop Psychology podcast. This is our third episode, and our topic for today is depression and suicide. Over the past week, we've seen a major film star committing suicide, and there's a lot of information going on around that, and it was quite saddening for many of his fans as well as other people in the industry, as well as Indians as a whole, and how the quarantine and how the film industry seems to be plagued with a lot of mental illnesses. So we just thought we'll take this opportunity to explain what is depression and how it might lead to suicide, and what is that process like. We have with us Mr. Harish Shankar again, and I'm Bhaskar. So we'll just start off the bat. Hari, what is depression? A lot of people use this word very casually, and when they're sad, they'll say, "I'm depressed," and then they'll watch something sad, and then they'll say, "I'm depressed." And I understand that the usage of the word is one part of the issue, that we use it too casually. But what is the disorder like? What is the How bad can it get, and how do you know if somebody has depression?
Right. So when we talk about depression, it is clinically speaking a mood disorder. So it comes under the spectrum of mood disorders, where you also have other similar conditions which affect one's mood primarily. Um, Now, when we talk about depression from a clinical perspective, you asked about symptoms, right? So you can broadly classify symptoms into three categories. So you have the emotional symptoms of depression, extreme sadness, prevalence of extreme sadness. That's one core symptom of depression. Some individuals may also experience other emotions such as guilt, feeling excessively guilty about what they have done or what they have said. And this could also be a common symptom in depression. Another very important diagnostic criteria for depression, an emotional symptom, is called as anhedonia. Now, what happens in anhedonia is the individual loses pleasure in previously pleasurable activities. Now, for example, if let's say an individual liked watching television or liked listening to music, during this episode of depression, the same TV shows or the same music is not pleasurable at all. So that's one other core symptom of depression, along with pervasive feelings of sadness and occasional guilt as well. You also have a whole lot of other symptoms which can be classified as cognitive symptoms, because these are primarily associated with your thoughts. So, for example, you may and they also overlap with emotions aspect. So it's not purely cognitive, not purely emotional. It's a mix of both. So, for example. Um, you can have these three core symptoms: helplessness, hopelessness, and worthlessness. Now, helplessness is where an individual feels that they have lost absolute control of whatever is happening. And what happens here is they may even start giving up because of this perceived loss of control. So, helplessness is very core and one of the most important symptoms of depression. We spoke about hopelessness. Now, hopelessness is about the future. And as the name suggests, they feel that the future is bleak, or things are going to remain the same, or they may even get worse. So, hopelessness talks about their attitudes about the future, and they believe that the future doesn't look very promising, or it's not a very optimistic view of the future. The third core aspect in this triad is the worthlessness symptom. And what happens in worthlessness is it's basically a comparison. So, compared to others or compared to my previous sense, I feel worthless. So, the aspects that get influenced or impacted by this core symptom is your sense of self, or self worth and self esteem. And in comparison to your previous self or with others, you feel that you're worthless. So, these are other core symptoms of depression, which overlap with the emotional aspects as well. Talking about other cognitive symptoms, some of your cognitive cognitive abilities may also get impaired as a consequence of depression. And what cognitive functions are we talking about? It could be basic functions such as memory, um, forgetting, and not directly as a consequence of depression, but because you're clouded by this emotional state, there is a high probability that this can also influence your cognitive functions.
I just want to ask you something. Um, like I'm hearing this, and when I was studying psychology, and when I didn't know much about normal psychology, I used to find it very difficult to understand how does a clinician know, right? How would you know if I have depression, or how would I know if I meet somebody that they are having some form of depression? Because the symptoms as excessive sadness, right? Now that's very subjective, excessive sadness. uh, I think one thing that our listeners can realize is that when we are saying all of these things, that hopelessness, worthlessness, helplessness, even sadness, they have to understand that it's not a momentary thing, or it's not for a few hours in a day. It's perpetually the entire day that they feel that way, right? That a person might feel that way, and for a large portion of the day, even if it's not the entire day. So that's something that I think people need to understand, that it's not momentary. So if you're feeling that way for an hour in a day because something has happened, it doesn't mean you are having depression, right? If it carries on for like 7 days or 2 weeks at least diagnostically, then it means that you're then it can be considered as somebody who's having a clinical problem. If every day you feel hopeless, helpless, worthless, and extreme amount of sadness, where you're crying each and every day for hours at a stretch. So that's something that people need to be able to differentiate, I think.
Absolutely. I think that's a very valid point, because it's very easy to self-diagnose. You hear about these things, read about these things in the newspapers. It's very easy to self-diagnose. But what I would suggest is, rather than self-diagnosing, it would be helpful if you consult somebody and get a more objective opinion about it. And by doing this, I'm not saying that you should ignore some of the symptoms that you're feeling, or probably belittle whatever you're going through. It's more about getting a more objective perspective rather than engaging in this dangerous tendency of self diagnosis and to some extent self interventions as well. So I think that's a very valid point. And in terms of diagnosis, there are multiple factors that we consider. One, we look at the presence or absence of these symptoms. We also look at the duration. Now, the duration is a very important aspect, because, like you rightly said, some of these symptoms are present in many individuals, but they may not be pervasive, or they would be only for a brief point of time. Again, I'm not discounting those episodes or discounting those experiences, they are equally valid. However, I'm just being cautious about this process of self diagnosis. So that's a very important aspect. And moving on, continuing with the concept of diagnosis or understanding how is somebody diagnosed with depression, along with the symptoms, along with the duration, we also look at the impact on their functioning. So some of these symptoms may have a huge impact on their functioning, on an individual's functioning, and that is one other parameter that we use to understand whether this requires intense, some form of mental health support, or even pharmacological support for that matter. Um, we were discussing about those symptoms, right? So we spoke about emotions. We also spoke about cognitions, right? One other cluster of symptoms that can get manifested in depression are your biological aspects. So, for example, there would be a decrease in libido. There would be changes in eating, including in eating patterns and even the experience of hunger. Similarly, your sleep can get affected. As a result of this, your fatigue levels, energy levels can get affected because of this. And then, in extreme cases, people may also have suicidal ideations. There would be crying behavior. There would also be, some form of social withdrawal. So these are all clusters, and depending on what diagnostic tool you use or diagnostic criteria, you have the ICD or the DSM. There are other ways to arrive at this. But I would like to reiterate this aspect of self-diagnosis. All of us are vulnerable to get into this, but then I would suggest a more objective stance.
That's true, and I think it's very interesting that you say that there are clusters, because when people think of depression, they just think of sadness and crying, but nobody really thinks guilt is a part of it. Nobody really thinks that I'm not sleeping enough, and that might be a part of it, or I'm sleeping too much, right? Or I'm eating too much, or I'm eating too little. People don't really think of these things as being part of the depressive symptoms, but that's something that maybe if you're listening in, you probably realize now, that there are lots of different clusters in which it can fit in. Yeah, but I appreciate the fact that self-diagnosis is not a great idea, uh, and it's not like mental illness is like a cough and cold or a fever where you can self-diagnose, take a medicine, and it won't affect you so much. Here, if you self-diagnose, then it probably will make you feel worse because of the stigma and taboo that is attached to it. So it's probably better to go to a clinician, accept the diagnosis if there is one, and then try and get better. The whole point is not to get stuck with the disorder, but try and improve your situation and try and get better, so that your functionality, etc., improves, and you feel better about yourself. uh, One interesting thing that I wanted to also discuss was, not everybody feels depression the same way, right? Uh, it's it's one of those disorders where if somebody say has a panic attack or an anxiety attack, the levels that they feel it at can be in a sort of way equated, because the symptoms will be similar. It's not the same for everybody. Obviously the subjective experience is there, but depression seems to have a larger range in its continuum, from somebody like, even some people even are laughing and still they might be feeling depressed, in what is known as mass depression, and then somebody might be on the other extreme where they feel suicidal ideation, that is, they feel vulnerable enough to commit suicide or self-harm. So that's a very large continuum. uh, what is your understanding of that?
Right, you're absolutely right, because some of these symptoms would be present in all types of depression, but the severity varies on a continuum. So, from a clinical perspective, we have mild, moderate, and severe depression. And when we talk about severe depression, that could also be associated with other symptoms. For example, you may have severe depression with psychotic features, or you may have other comorbidities associated with severe depression. Uh, the symptoms may be common. The number of symptoms that are present and the intensity of the symptoms varies across these three broad categories. For example, in terms of mild depression, the number of symptoms would be comparatively smaller, and the intensity of those symptoms would also be comparatively lower as compared to the other two clusters, which are basically moderate and severe depression. In severe depression, sometimes people may also experience what is called as catatonia, that is, some form of impairment in movement. Extreme fatigue, and in terms of their cognitions, like we discussed earlier, they may also have suicidal ideation. So this is one core distinguishing factor, suicidal ideation, which separates these three groups.
In light of what's happened with Sushant Singh Rajput, and my condolences go out to his family and everyone who's affected by his death. uh, One of the things I kept hearing around social media and with my neighbors, etc., they said that he was rich and he was successful, and he had all the material things that anyone could want for. Like, he looked good, he had a six-pack ab. People are saying all of these things, and then they couldn't understand why he committed suicide. Now, as a psychologist and somebody who studied clinical psychology, uh, like, I understand why he might have. Could you elaborate on uh, trying to explain to people how all this materialistic wealth and how looking good, etc., may not really overcome the the mental health that is depression.
True, true, absolutely. I think you have answered my question because earlier when you spoke about people's, perceptions of success as being measured by these material goods or achievements, what I would like to highlight is every individual may have their own definition of success, and even if they reach that parameter which they have set for themselves, it doesn't mean that they are less vulnerable to develop depression, or if they don't achieve success they will get depression. So it doesn't work in a linear fashion. So I would like to highlight two aspects of this. One, people's perceptions doesn't necessarily mean that they understand what the individual is going through. You might own all of these material things, you would be probably meeting other standards of success, but still you may not be able to understand what this individual is going through. So that is one aspect about subjective perceptions, and that doesn't really mean that the individual is free from any emotional distress. There's one philosophical route to understand, this specific perspective. When we talk about materialistic goods, or socio-constructivist definitions of success, if you live in a specific building, or if you have so many number of cars, or if you are employed in so and so place, then you're successful, or more than success, people expect that you are happy, but that doesn't necessarily be the should be the case, because these materialistic pleasures create a sense of what Aristotle calls as hedonia, so which is pure pleasure, and this is different from eudaimonia. Now, what happens in hedonia is it's pure pleasure. It's not pervasive. So imagine the pleasure that you get after eating an ice cream cone. You feel good about it, but it doesn't really last forever. And the point I'm trying to drive home is that these materialistic goods contribute more to hedonia and not necessarily eudaimonia. So instead, working on something that you're really passionate about, irrespective of the materialistic goods that you enjoy, working on a hobby that you really like pursuing, these kind of activities actually contribute to eudaimonia. And that would be what Aristotle calls as true happiness, something that can actually make a difference.
Yeah, I think that's very relevant in what you're saying, that everyone has a subjective perception. I think uh, everybody who's not at Sushant Singh Rajput's level, in terms of fame or in terms of success, thinks that that level is great, and he probably thought Shah Rukh Khan's level is great, and Shah Rukh Khan probably thinks somebody else's level is great, and that person thinks Bill Gates' level is great, and Bill Gates thinks somebody else's level is great. There is no end to this. There is no end to this. There is Human desires are not one; they are multifaceted. So for someone, making money is important, but someone who's made money, for that person, maybe having a political power is important, and somebody who has political power, maybe having a sustained relationship is important. Someone who has that, maybe for them money is important. So there is that entire chain of desires that we have, and it's so multifaceted. So I think one thing people forget is that uh, we are never really satisfied, and happiness never comes from achieving something. It'll give you that momentary thing, but happiness and satisfaction are very different things. So I think that's one bit. And I think from whatever I've heard about Sushant's case and whatever I'm seeing on the news and all, I don't know how much of it is believable, but he seems to be somebody who was under a lot of distress. uh, his manager passed away 2 days before he committed suicide. uh, his movies were cancelled. And obviously he had his financial issues, and his career at 34. uh, so it makes a difference, and uh, like, it obviously was bothering him, and he was probably alone in that house for so many months because of the quarantine. So when I think about him, I think of somebody who was in a lot of pain, probably a lot of distress, but we may not be able to understand it, because we think that you're in Bollywood, so your entire life is a dance party, but that's obviously not true. um, so what if suppose I have I'm suffering from some form of depression, any form of disorder, right? For depression, let's just take depression for now. What is the solution? What should I do?
Okay, so I think the best thing that you can probably do is to get an objective and a professional evaluation done. So what exactly is going through, so and a psychologist will probably listen to your the symptoms that you're experiencing, will evaluate various other aspects, look at what are some of the symptoms that you're experiencing, and then take a call on this, call on the interventions. So, what happens in a typical CBT session? We start with something called as behavior activation. Now, because of the symptoms that we discussed earlier, anhedonia, withdrawal, fatigue, an individual may not feel motivated, or an individual may feel that they do not have the energy to carry out some of the basic activities that they used to do earlier. So, in behavior activation, what happens is we look at tasks of pleasure and tasks of mastery. Now, what are tasks of pleasure? It is targeted at the symptom of anhedonia to improve one's mood. So, we discuss with the individual, we look at what gave them pleasure earlier, and then we make a schedule where they can attempt probably for about 15 to 20 minutes per day to try something to try out some of these activities which can give them pleasure. Tasks of mastery, on the other hand, are more complicated in the sense they involve more effort from the individual's side, and they are also targeted at um, developing a sense of achievement, which can also have an impact on the individual's self-esteem. So we start with this task of mastery, tasks of pleasure. Parallelly, we also look at the individual's cognitions, basically the thought patterns. And we may recommend a thought diary, which can be maintained for, let's say, about a week or two before we review that. And then we start the process of cognitive behavior therapy. So these are some of the things.
When you're saying all of these strategies, these are what the clinician will try and tell the client to do, right? But it's not one session. So how long does one uh, have to typically go through therapy? For, on an average or something like that, if you can tell people listening in, so that they get a sense of that. I think that knowing how much time it will require gives a sense of safety rather than the unknown of I don't know how long it'll take. And I understand that it's probably I don't know how long it'll take because it's all subjective and depends on the person's problem. But typically there must be some ratio that you can tell us.
So it depends on a lot of factors like the severity of the problem, what form of therapy you are providing, and things like that. But I would say typically around 12 to 15 sessions would be required for a CBT session, a cognitive behavior therapy session. So these sessions could be once a week, if required, twice a week, depending on the severity of the problem. So, but I would say on an average, 12 to 15 sessions.
Okay. And parallelly, the person is also taking medication, right? So if they've come to a clinical psychologist, the psychologist will ask them to meet a psychiatrist, and then there is medication going on as well as therapy, right? Typically, or is that also different?
Okay, now that depends on the intensity of the problem. Now, if you look at the gold standard treatment protocol for depression, if it is mild depression, then they suggest about 12 to 15 sessions of CBT, cognitive behavior therapy. If it is a more severe form like moderate depression or severe depression, then yes, we may also require a consultation from a psychiatrist who would again evaluate the severity of the symptoms and prescribe the medications according to his or her evaluation.
All right. Thank you, Hari. I think this was a wonderful session, and I'm sure people listening in would have learned quite a bit about depression, about the treatment, and how there is a continuum of difference of how people feel depressed. And I hope that they learn not to use that term colloquially and easily, because it's a serious problem, and I think to use it as less as possible, only for people who are affected by it, makes a lot more sense because it gives seriousness to the word. And TV shows might be using that and seeming cool, but Our lives are not TV shows, and I don't think we should run it like that. With that, I think we're done with episode number 3. Thank you for listening in. This is the One Stop Psychology podcast, and we will see you soon.